Ryan was a 14-year-old teenager, and that summer his parents decided they would spend a few days camping in a remote location near a lake. They arrived at the destination with the sun still high, surrounded by imposing and silent nature. The landscape was serene, with tall trees forming a kind of green wall around the lake, and the sound of the water gently lapping against the shore completed the scene of tranquility. While his parents set up the tent, Ryan, naturally restless, decided to explore the surroundings. There was something about that forest that made him uneasy, though he couldn't pinpoint what it was. The silence was almost absolute, interrupted only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. Even so, he tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, a result of being far from civilization. When the tent was finally up and the fire lit, the family decided to rest around the campfire. But while his parents chatted carefree, Ryan could barely focus. His eyes constantly scanned the forest around them, as if expecting to see something moving in the shadows. As night fell, the forest, which had seemed so calm before, now filled with unfamiliar sounds. Ryan lay inside the tent, but sleep would not come. The feeling that something was off persisted. He couldn't shake the idea that something was watching them, hidden in the darkness of the night. This was Ryan's first night at the camp, and he had no idea that it would be only the beginning of a series of events that would change his life forever. The next morning, Ryan woke up early, even before his parents. The sun had barely risen on the horizon, and the mist rising from the lake gave the place a mysterious air. Still feeling the unease from the previous night, he decided to grab his soccer ball and distract himself a bit, believing that some physical activity might shake off that strange feeling. He started kicking the ball around the camp, trying to keep his mind occupied. The ball bounced from side to side, and Ryan felt momentarily better, as if everything was normal. But then, with a stronger kick, the ball slipped out of his control and rolled into the forest. Ryan hesitated for a moment. The darkness between the trees was intimidating, and the memory of the discomfort from the night before made him question whether he should follow the ball. However, he convinced himself that he was just being silly. Taking a deep breath, Ryan entered the forest. As he moved away from the camp, the sunlight began to filter through the trees, creating long, distorted shadows. Ryan followed the ball's path, but soon realized he was going farther than he had intended. The forest's silence was even more oppressive now, and each step seemed to echo strangely. And then he saw it. Standing between the trees was a dark silhouette, motionless, watching him. Ryan froze in place, his heart racing. The figure was distant but clearly visible. It wasn't large, but there was something profoundly unsettling about it. He tried to rationalize, thinking it could be a tree trunk or a strange shadow, but something inside him knew that wasn't the case. Ryan wanted to scream, to run back to the camp, but his feet seemed glued to the ground. He didn't know how long he stood there, just staring at the silhouette until, in the blink of an eye, it vanished. Without thinking twice, Ryan turned and ran back to the camp, panic gripping every fiber of his being. When he finally arrived back, his parents were still asleep, oblivious to the terror he had just experienced. He threw himself into the tent, panting, trying to process what had happened. He didn't know who or what that silhouette was, but he was certain he was not alone in that forest. Ryan spent the rest of the day in a constant state of alert. He tried to act normally so as not to alarm his parents, but what he had seen that morning wouldn't leave his mind. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide something, and he could barely concentrate on anything else. His parents, carefree, planned a hike around the lake, but Ryan made up an excuse to stay at the camp. Once he was finally alone, he decided he needed to understand what he had seen. Maybe, he thought, if he returned to the spot where the silhouette had appeared, he could find some logical explanation. Taking a deep breath, Ryan headed back to the part of the forest where he had lost the ball. The sun was higher now, and the light pierced through the trees, creating an environment less frightening than the previous morning. But even with the brightness, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He reached the exact spot where he had stopped earlier and began to examine the ground. The ground was covered in leaves and dry branches, nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. Ryan scanned the surroundings with his eyes, trying to find any sign of the figure's presence. That's when he saw it, near a fallen tree trunk, a strange mark on the ground. It looked like a footprint, but not from an animal. The shape was irregular, and the size suggested something human, but deformed, as if someone had stepped with a poorly fitted boot. Ryan felt a shiver run down his spine. As he observed the mark on the ground, he had the sensation that something moved in his peripheral vision. He quickly turned, and there it was again, the silhouette. This time, it was closer, but still indistinct, like a shadow cast by Ryan's own fear. But what terrified him most wasn't just seeing the silhouette, but realizing that it was looking directly at him. Although he couldn't see eyes or a face, Ryan felt the weight of that gaze, cold and penetrating. The air around him seemed to freeze, and the forest's silence became deafening. Ryan couldn't move. Fear paralyzed him, and his mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. The silhouette didn't move, just observed, and then, as suddenly as it appeared, it dissolved into the shadows of the forest, leaving Ryan alone and trembling. He returned to the camp as quickly as his legs would carry him. But this time, he couldn't pretend that everything was okay. The vision of that silhouette, the piercing gaze, the deformed footprint, everything was beyond his comprehension. He knew he had to tell his parents, but something inside him said they wouldn't understand, or worse, wouldn't believe him. Sitting by the campfire his parents had lit for dinner, Ryan was silent, lost in his thoughts. He knew that the figure, that shadow, wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Something or someone was in the forest with them, and he feared that whatever it wasn't there by accident. That night, Ryan couldn't sleep. Every noise, every whisper of the wind through the trees seemed laden with hidden intentions, and for the first time, he wished he had never come to that camp. Night fell over the camp with an unusual swiftness. The twilight, which normally offered a smooth transition between day and darkness, was replaced by a dense, oppressive blackness that swallowed the surrounding forest. Ryan sat by the campfire his parents had lit, but the warmth of the flames did little to ease the chill he felt inside. His parents, unaware of the terror consuming their son, chatted casually about the beauty of nature and their plans for the next day. Ryan tried to join the conversation, but his mind was far away, fixated on the image of that silhouette that had haunted him since the morning. As the night wore on, Ryan noticed that his parents were starting to feel tired and were preparing to go to bed. He, however, knew he wouldn't be able to close his eyes, not after what he had seen. He offered to stay up a little longer and tend the fire, an excuse to avoid entering the tent and surrendering to the darkness of the night. As the rhythmic sound of his parents' breathing came from inside the tent, Ryan remained by the fire, feeding the flames with twigs and dry branches. The forest around him was incredibly silent, which only heightened the sense that something was wrong. Even the nocturnal animals seemed to avoid that part of the woods. Then he heard it. Footsteps, not far from the camp, but close enough for him to identify. They were slow, deliberate footsteps that approached and then moved away, as if someone were circling around, watching but avoiding being seen. Ryan held his breath, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. The footsteps continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always present. He wanted to believe it was just an animal, but the regularity and the way the sound seemed to circle the camp left him with no doubt that it was someone or something walking around. Suddenly, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was even more disturbing. Ryan stayed still, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the reach of the flames. And then, at the edge of his vision, he saw a shadow move between the trees. It wasn't the silhouette he had seen before, but something smaller, more agile, but still frightening. Ryan didn't dare move. He knew that any sudden movement could attract the attention of whatever was lurking in the darkness. Time seemed to drag on, and he felt cold sweat running down his back. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run into the tent, wake his parents, do something, but he was frozen by fear. When he finally managed to move, it was only to feed the fire with more wood, hoping that the flames would scare off whatever was out there. Minutes passed like hours, and eventually, the footsteps didn't return. However, Ryan knew that whatever it was still nearby, waiting for the right moment to approach again. When the sun began to rise, bringing the light of morning and dispelling the night's darkness, Ryan felt a momentary relief. But as he looked around the camp, he saw something that made his heart nearly stop. Tracks on the ground. Footprints circling the camp, clearly human, but with a slightly distorted shape, like the ones he had seen in the forest. He realized that the threat was not only real, but much closer than he could have imagined. And with the daylight, the terror of the night only transformed into a new form of fear. The fear that the darkness would return, and with it, the thing that was hunting him. Ryan decided he could no longer keep this to himself. He needed to tell his parents, even if they didn't believe him. Because now, it was clear to him that it wasn't just his imagination. Something was hunting them, and it was only a matter of time before it made its move. The dawn brought with it an unusual chill, as if the forest itself was warning that something dark was lurking. Ryan had barely slept, the events of the previous night still fresh in his mind. He knew he couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. So, determined, he waited for his parents to wake up to tell them everything. When his parents finally emerged from the tent, they noticed that Ryan was agitated and looked exhausted. He then recounted the strange sounds he had heard during the night, the footprints around the camp, and the silhouette he had seen the day before. However, as he feared, his parents attributed everything to his vivid imagination, saying it was normal to feel a little nervous in such a different environment from the city. Still, concerned about Ryan's state, his parents decided to stay at the camp during the morning instead of going on the hike they had planned. Wanting to distract him, they suggested they go fishing at the lake. Reluctant, but not wanting to appear more frightened than he already was, Ryan agreed. As they walked to the lake's shore, the tension seemed to ease a bit. The sun was high and bright, and the scenery around them was stunning. It seemed almost impossible that something so disturbing could exist in such a beautiful place. Ryan began to think that maybe his parents were right, that maybe it was all just his imagination. Then, during the walk, they came across an old fishing cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, with worn wood and a door partially off its hinges. Ryan's father, always curious, suggested they take a look inside, and everyone agreed. The inside of the cabin was dusty, but surprisingly, there was still some old furniture and tools scattered around. However, what caught Ryan's attention was a corner of the cabin where there was a small pile of clothes and personal belongings, all covered in a thin layer of dust, but clearly belonging to someone who had been there not too long ago. Ryan knelt down and began to examine the items. There was a worn backpack, some cooking utensils, and an old hardcover diary with yellowed pages. Curious, he opened the diary and started flipping through the first pages. What he read there made the blood freeze in his veins. The diary belonged to a young woman named Emily, who had apparently come to camp in the same area a few years ago. The first entries were cheerful, describing the beauty of the place and the activities she planned to do. But as Ryan advanced through the pages, the tone of the entries changed drastically. Emily began to report strange occurrences during the night. Footsteps, the feeling of being watched, and the appearance of a dark figure among the trees. The last entry, written hurriedly and almost illegibly, described a particularly terrifying night when Emily believed she was being chased. She mentioned finding strange footprints around her tent and planned to escape in the morning. The entry ended abruptly, and the diary contained nothing more. Ryan showed the diary to his parents, who finally began to worry. They vaguely remembered hearing a story about a young woman who had disappeared in that area, but had never paid much attention to it. Now, however, everything seemed to fit together in a horrifying way. Ryan's father decided it would be best to return to the camp immediately, pack up, and leave as soon as possible. The idea that something bad might have happened to Emily, and that they might be in the same danger, finally hit them. But as they hurried back along the trail, Ryan couldn't shake the thought that they weren't alone. Something or someone was in the forest, and it knew they were there. And just as it had happened to Emily, that something was just waiting for the right moment to strike. The terror Ryan had felt before was now completely justified, and as he looked at the forest around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the silhouette he had seen earlier was much closer than they imagined. Upon returning to the camp, Ryan and his parents were determined to leave as quickly as possible. Discovering Emily's diary had turned what had once been a peaceful trip into a terrifying experience. As they began to dismantle the tents and pack their belongings, the nervousness was palpable. They moved quickly, casting anxious glances from time to time toward the forest, as if fearing something might emerge from the shadows at any moment. Then a distant sound of footsteps broke the silence, making them stop instantly. Ryan looked in the direction of the sound and saw a man approaching. He was wearing an outfit that resembled that of a park ranger, with a battered hat and an olive-green jacket. There was something strange about his appearance, maybe the way he walked, somewhat awkwardly, or the expression on his face, which was both friendly and unsettling. The man waved at the family and introduced himself as the ranger responsible for the area. He said he was making his usual rounds and had noticed their camp. While the presence of a ranger seemed like a reassuring coincidence, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The ranger began asking questions about the family's stay, how long they had been camping, if they had seen or heard anything unusual, and if they had encountered anyone else in the forest. There was something in his tone that made Ryan uncomfortable. The questions were asked in a friendly manner, but there was a subtle insistence that made him question the man's true intentions. Ryan's father, still nervous after discovering the diary, briefly mentioned Emily's story and asked the ranger if he knew anything about her disappearance. The ranger's face hardened for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure and said that many people go missing in the forests and that it was easy to get lost if you didn't know the area well. Ryan noticed a strange gleam in the man's eyes as he spoke about the disappearances, as if he were hiding something. By now, his suspicion had turned into fear. He felt that the ranger knew more than he was letting on, and that perhaps, in some way, he was connected to the strange occurrences in the forest. After a few more unsettling questions, the ranger wished them a safe journey and said it was best to leave before it got dark. He bid them farewell with a smile that, to Ryan, seemed more like a veiled threat than a friendly gesture. After the ranger disappeared into the forest, the family continued packing in silence. The encounter had left everyone feeling uneasy, and the decision to leave was now a matter of urgency. But as Ryan helped pack the last of their belongings, he couldn't stop thinking about the ranger and how he had appeared at the exact moment they were about to leave. When they were finally ready to go, Ryan took one last look at the forest. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Something in that forest was watching them, and he knew it wouldn't end when they left. The shadow that had been following him wasn't confined to the forest. It would follow them wherever they went. With the car packed and ready to go, the family got inside, and Ryan's father started the engine. As they drove away, Ryan saw, in the rear-view mirror, the figure of the ranger watching them from a distance, standing between the trees, as if making sure they were really leaving. The man's gaze met Ryan's through the mirror, sending a chill down the boy's spine. Even after they had driven away and the forest began to disappear on the horizon, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow following them now had a face. After leaving the campsite, Ryan's family drove out of the forest, relieved to be finally moving away from that sinister place. However, the silence in the car was heavy, as if everyone was struggling to process the events of the past hours. Ryan, in particular, was lost in his thoughts, trying to make sense of what had happened and what might still lie ahead. As the dirt road wound through the forest, the car jolted with every bump and dip. Ryan's father kept his eyes fixed on the road, determined to get them out of there as quickly as possible. Ryan's mother, sitting beside him, occasionally glanced back, as if expecting to see something or someone following them. Suddenly, the car gave a harder jolt and the engine began to sputter. Ryan's father frowned and tried to accelerate, but the car coughed and came to a complete stop, with thin smoke rising from the hood. He cursed under his breath and got out of the car, gesturing for Ryan to stay inside while he checked the problem. Ryan watched his father open the hood and inspect the engine, but something was bothering him. The forest around them seemed darker than before, the shadows between the trees lengthening in a way that didn't match the time of day. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched again. It was then that he heard the sound. It was low but distinct, the same sound of footsteps he had heard the previous night. Ryan froze, his eyes frantically searching for the source of the sound. But no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't see anything. Just the trees, still and ominous. Ryan's father returned to the car, announcing that the problem seemed serious and that they would need to walk until they found help or a cell phone signal. Ryan's mother suggested that they stay together, but his father, always practical, decided it would be faster if he went alone to the main road, which shouldn't be far. Reluctantly, but with no other choice, Ryan and his mother stayed in the car while his father walked away down the dirt road. With every step he took, Ryan felt a knot forming in his stomach. Something was wrong, very wrong, but he couldn't put it into words. He wanted to shout for his father to come back, but what could he say? That he was afraid of shadows and footsteps that might not even exist? The minutes dragged on. Ryan and his mother remained in the car, trying to stay calm, but the silence around them was unbearable. The sound of the footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. Ryan started counting the minutes since his father had left, but as the time passed 30 minutes, worry turned to fear. Suddenly, Ryan noticed movement to his left among the trees. It was a figure, a bit distant, but clearly human. His heart raced, and he prepared to alert his mother, but something stopped him. The figure was walking slowly away, but there was something strangely familiar about it. With his heart pounding, Ryan opened the car door and stepped out, following the figure with his eyes. The silhouette moved with the same disturbing slowness he had seen before, and fear gripped him. He wanted to run after his father, but something about that figure drew him like a magnet. Against his better judgment, Ryan began to follow the figure into the forest, his feet moving almost on their own. He heard the sounds around him, branches snapping under his steps, the rustling of leaves, but everything seemed distant, as if he were in a dream. The figure, always ahead, never looked back, but Ryan knew it was intentional. It was as if he was being led to a destination he didn't want to know. Ryan didn't know how much time had passed until the figure finally stopped at the edge of a small clearing. It stood there, motionless, as if waiting for him. Ryan, at last, also stopped, his body tense with fear and anticipation. It was then that the figure began to turn slowly, revealing a face Ryan would never forget. It wasn't the shadow he had seen before, but a distorted expression, a mask of madness and despair. And then the truth hit him hard. That figure wasn't his father. It was the forest ranger. Before Ryan could react, the man smiled in a way that froze his blood. It was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. Ryan knew he was in mortal danger, but his feet seemed glued to the ground, unable to move him away from there. The man took a step forward, and Ryan finally found the strength to move. He turned and ran back to the car, the sound of snapping branches behind him indicating he was being chased. Absolute terror propelled him as he ran through the forest, trying to remember the way back. When he finally saw the car in the distance, his mother outside calling for him, Ryan screamed desperately. He didn't know how, but he had to reach her before the man caught up. When he finally reached the car, panting and trembling, he threw himself into his mother's arms, who was in a panic. Without wasting time, she pushed him into the car, locking the doors. Both looked at the road, but the forest ranger had disappeared again, as if he had never been there. But Ryan knew he was nearby, and he knew his father was in danger. Ryan and his mother were locked in the car. The silence was dense, almost suffocating. The forest ranger's sudden disappearance made it clear that the situation was more dangerous than they had imagined. Ryan's mind spun with thoughts about his father, who was out there, alone, possibly in great danger. Ryan's mother, struggling to stay calm, tried to start the car again, but the engine only sputtered before going silent once more. Desperate, she began trying to pick up any cell signal, but nothing worked. They were completely isolated, without communication, without a vehicle, and worse, with the certainty that someone was hunting them. Ryan, still panting and with his heart racing, looked out at the forest around them, expecting to see the forest ranger at any moment. But for now, the only sound he heard was his own breathing and the faint rustling of the trees in the wind. Night was approaching, and with it, the darkness that seemed to hide all the terrors Ryan feared. Then he heard it, a low, distant sound, like a murmur. Ryan strained to listen better, and soon the sound became clearer. It was a type of rhythmic thumping, but muffled, as if it were coming from within the earth. He looked at his mother, who had also heard it, and they exchanged glances, silently trying to understand what it was. "It's coming from the forest," Ryan said, his voice trembling. His mother nodded, hesitant but determined to protect her son. "We need to find your father," she said, her voice heavy with worry. "He might be in trouble." Despite the fear he felt, Ryan knew she was right. They couldn't just sit there, waiting for something to find them. They decided to leave the car and follow the sound, believing it might lead them to some clue as to where his father was. Armed only with a flashlight and desperate courage, the two began walking into the forest. As they delved deeper into the darkness between the trees, the sound grew stronger. It wasn't a common thumping, it almost sounded like a drum, reverberating through the ground and making Ryan's heartbeat in sync with the unsettling rhythm. They walked for a few minutes until the thumping began to be accompanied by a metallic sound, like something being dragged. Soon, they saw something between the trees, a faint, flickering light emanating from a small cabin partially hidden by vegetation. Ryan immediately recognized it as the same cabin where they had found Emily's diary earlier. He felt a chill run down his spine. The cabin was abandoned, or at least it should have been. Approaching cautiously, the two stopped at the entrance. The door, previously fallen, was now precariously propped on its hinges. The light emanating from inside came from an old oil lantern, flickering as if about to go out. Ryan smelled the strong odor of burning oil mixed with something more pungent, something that made his stomach turn. Suddenly, the metallic sound stopped, and the silence that followed was even more disturbing. Ryan and his mother hesitated, but they knew they had to go inside. With the flashlight trembling in his hand, Ryan pushed the door, which creaked loudly, echoing through the empty cabin. The interior was even darker than he remembered, except for the lantern. But now there was something new. In the center of the cabin, on a rustic table, was a wooden box, closed. Around it there were marks on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged recently. Ryan looked at his mother, who encouraged him to open the box. With trembling hands, he turned the small rusty latch and lifted the lid. Inside, there was a strange object, an old leather mask, grotesque and deformed. as if it had been worn for a long time. Below it, there was a yellowed piece of paper folded. Ryan took the paper, his hands sweating, and unfolded it. It was a letter, hastily written, with almost illegible handwriting. The words were disjointed, but one sentence stood out. He wears the mask to hide, but the eyes, you will recognize them. Ryan's heart nearly stopped. He knew who the letter referred to, the forest ranger. That disturbing smile, the eyes full of madness. It all made sense now. The man they had encountered wasn't just a simple ranger, but someone much more dangerous. Someone who had been hiding among the trees, watching, waiting. Before they could process what they had discovered, a loud noise came from outside the cabin, something heavy hitting the ground. Ryan and his mother froze, their eyes wide with terror. The sound was coming towards the cabin, each step echoing like a harbinger of the danger approaching. With no other option, the two retreated into the cabin, locking the makeshift door behind them. They knew the old door wouldn't protect them for long, but it was all they had. With their hearts pounding, they waited, knowing that whatever was out there was coming. Ryan held the flashlight tightly, the flickering light revealing the fear in his eyes. The rhythmic thumping resumed, now closer, stronger, as if it were pounding directly into their hearts. They couldn't see what was coming, but they knew it was only a matter of time before the door gave way and the true horror was revealed. The relentless pounding on the cabin door made Ryan's and his mother's hearts beat in unison with the menacing sound. Every blow against the weakened wood sounded like an announcement that time was running out. They knew the door wouldn't hold for much longer, and the presence of the forest ranger outside was palpable, like a shadow about to engulf them. Ryan tried to think quickly. The grotesque mask and the letter they found in the box wouldn't leave his mind. The connection between the man they encountered and the mask was evident, but what did you will recognize them mean? It was clear that the forest ranger wasn't who he claimed to be, but who he really was still remained a mystery. While they desperately searched for a way out, Ryan's gaze fell on a corner of the cabin that hadn't been explored before. A small opening in the floor, covered by an old dusty rug. He quickly pulled the rug aside, revealing a hatch. Without thinking twice, he and his mother opened the hatch and descended into the space below, closing it behind them as quietly as possible. Below, the darkness was total, but at least they were hidden. Ryan held the flashlight tightly and turned it back on, illuminating the small space that seemed to be some sort of makeshift basement. The walls of damp earth and the old shelves were full of dust-covered objects. It was as if no one had been there for years. While Ryan's mother struggled to keep her breathing under control, he began to search the shelves for anything that might help them understand more about what was happening. His fingers touched something soft, and he pulled out an old book bound in dark leather. The title, almost illegible, was embossed in faded gold letters. "It must be Emily's diary," Ryan whispered, though fear was tightening his throat. They heard a crash above them. The cabin door had been broken down. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed above as the intruder frantically searched for them. Ryan knew they had little time. He flipped through the diary quickly, trying to find some clue that might help them escape the situation. The first pages contained entries they were already familiar with, but as they progressed, Emily's words became more desperate, almost incoherent. She talked about being watched, feeling that something was always behind her, but what made Ryan stop was a specific mention of the mask. "He wears the mask to hide his true face," Emily wrote. "But the eyes are what you must fear. He is what hides in the shadows, the one who brings terror, not as a person, but as something much worse." Ryan felt a chill as he read those words. Emily was describing what he had already felt, that the forest ranger wasn't just a man, but something much more sinister, something that fed on fear, that hid behind a human facade. Then, on one of the last pages, Ryan found a passage that made his heart race. He was one of us. Someone the forest consumed. The mask. It's the only thing that ties him to what's left of his humanity. He doesn't remember who he was, but the eyes. If you look into his eyes, you'll see the truth. Their reading was interrupted by the sound of footsteps above the hatch. Ryan and his mother held their breath, hoping the intruder wouldn't find them. But then, the sound stopped, followed by a deadly silence. Ryan knew this wasn't a good sign. He closed the diary and looked at his mother, who was pale and tense. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, and Ryan knew she was right. With hearts racing, they began searching for an alternative exit. In one of the earthen walls, there was a small hole, large enough for them to crawl through. There was no time to waste. Ryan was the first to pass through, followed closely by his mother. The tunnel was claustrophobic, and the air was heavy and damp, but they kept moving, guided only by the hope of escaping. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged on the other side of the hill, still within the forest but far enough from the cabin. The fresh air had never felt so good. But the feeling of relief was brief, as both knew they were still far from being safe. As they caught their breath, Ryan turned to look at the clearing in the distance. Nothing moved, but he knew the threat was still there, waiting, hunting. The only thing he knew for sure was that the man they had encountered wasn't just a psychopath. He was something much worse, something the forest had created or awakened. "Let's go, we need to keep moving," his mother said, pulling him by the arm. They started running again, with the sound of the forest around them following like a warning that night was coming, and with it, the terrors Ryan and his family still had to face. Ryan and his mother ran through the forest, fear coursing through their veins, fueling every step they took. The knowledge they had gained in the cabin's basement only made the situation more desperate. They weren't just fleeing from a simple man. They were being hunted by something much darker, something that seemed to merge with the forest itself. Night was beginning to fall, and with it, the temperature dropped rapidly, making the environment even more inhospitable. Exhaustion began to weigh on them, but stopping wasn't an option. Every shadow seemed to hide a pair of eyes, and every branch that snapped under their feet made Ryan's heart race. Finally, exhausted, they stopped in a small clearing, just enough to catch their breath for a few moments. Ryan's mother, always practical, tried to stay calm and think of a strategy. They knew they couldn't just keep running without direction. They needed to find a way to defend themselves, or at least buy some time. "We need to set a trap," she suggested, panting. "If we can lure that thing to a place where we can surprise it, we might have a chance to escape." Ryan nodded, though the idea of facing the creature that was hunting them was terrifying. But he knew his mother was right. Continuing to run without a plan was suicide. Together, they began to work quickly, using what the surrounding forest offered. They found an old, abandoned bear trap, probably left by some hunter long ago. With much effort, they managed to activate it and hide it among leaves and branches near a tree where the darkness would be their ally. "Now, we just need to lure it here," Ryan said, his voice low, trying not to let the fear show. But how to lure something that is more cunning and dangerous than any predator he had ever known? That's when Ryan had an idea. He remembered Emily's diary, the words she had written about the mask and the man's eyes. Something about it was important, maybe even vital. And somehow, he knew that the creature, or the man, whatever it was still connected to that mask. Ryan took the grotesque mask they had found in the cabin, now stuffed in his backpack, and carefully placed it on the ground near the trap. He felt a shiver as he touched it, as if dealing with something evil, but he knew it could be the bait they needed. They hid behind a large tree, a few meters away, their breaths held. Now, all that was left was to wait. Time seemed to drag on as the darkness deepened, and the sound of the forest around them seemed amplified by the tense silence that enveloped them. The sound of distant footsteps made Ryan's blood run cold. They were heavy and slow, but clearly heading their way. He exchanged a quick glance with his mother, both aware that the moment was approaching. The figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, moving with a strange combination of precision and carelessness. It was the forest ranger, or at least the thing wearing that appearance. He stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed on the mask on the ground. Ryan could almost feel the creature's internal conflict, as if the mask both attracted and repelled it at the same time. The man took a hesitant step forward, then another, slowly approaching the mask. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the creature crouched down, reaching out to grab the mask. At that exact moment, the trap snapped shut with a metallic clang. The creature screamed, an inhuman sound mixed with anger and pain. Ryan and his mother exchanged looks, surprised and terrified at the same time. They had succeeded, but they were not out of danger yet. The forest ranger, or what was left of him, was trapped, the trap gripping his leg tightly. However, what happened next was something Ryan couldn't have anticipated. Instead of trying to free himself, the creature began to laugh. A low, guttural laugh that sent a shiver down Ryan's spine. "What do you think you've achieved, boy?" the creature growled, its voice distorted by hatred. "Do you think a trap will stop me? This is nothing compared to what's coming." Ryan was paralyzed with fear, but his mother's firm hand on his arm pulled him back to reality. "Let's go, now!" she shouted, and they began running again, leaving the clearing behind. The creature's laughter echoed through the forest, growing more distant as they ran, but its words lingered in Ryan's mind. He knew this wasn't the end. The creature was trapped, but not defeated. And there was a greater threat lurking in the forest, something they still didn't fully understand. With dawn approaching, Ryan and his mother knew they needed to find a way to escape once and for all. But the question that loomed in their minds was whether they could survive the night and what it might still bring. The first light of dawn was beginning to tint the sky when Ryan and his mother, exhausted and scared, finally stopped to catch their breath. They had run as far as they could, trying to leave the creature and the horrors of the night behind. But the silence around them brought no comfort, only a new wave of anxiety, for they knew the threat wasn't over. They found themselves in a new clearing, surrounded by tall, thick trees. The air was cold and damp, and the sounds of the forest were beginning to manifest with the awakening of the birds. Despite the growing light, the feeling of being watched remained, as if the forest itself were alive, conspiring against them. Ryan's mother sat on a fallen log, her hands trembling as she tried to calm her breathing. Ryan, still tense, remained standing, looking around like a cornered animal. He knew they needed to rest, but his mind couldn't shut off from the danger that still lurked. "We need to find your father," Ryan's mother said, her voice firm despite the evident fear. She was trying to maintain composure, but the desperation was clear in her eyes. Ryan agreed, but something else was deeply troubling him. The creature, the forest ranger, had mentioned something before they fled, something about what was to come. It was a veiled threat, but he felt there was something more sinister and greater that they still didn't understand. They needed a plan, something that would give them a chance to find Ryan's father and get out of that forest once and for all. As they discussed their options, a distant sound caught both their attention. It was faint, but distinct. A scream, a human scream. "Dad!" Ryan exclaimed, his heart racing. Without hesitation, he began running toward the sound, with his mother close behind. Every step took them deeper into the forest, where the sunlight barely penetrated, leaving everything shrouded in constant twilight. The scream echoed again, but this time it was more distant. Ryan forced his legs to move faster, the fear of losing his father overcoming the exhaustion. They followed the sound for several more minutes, but it seemed to be getting farther and farther away. Despair began to set in, and Ryan started to wonder if they were being led into a trap. Finally, they reached a point where the scream ceased. They were breathless, looking around frantically, but all they saw were trees and shadows. The silence was deafening, as if the forest were waiting to reveal something terrible. "Dad!" Ryan shouted, his voice filled with panic. There was no answer. It was then that he realized. His mother was no longer by his side. Ryan spun around quickly, his heart almost stopping. "Mom?" he called out, but there was no response. The spot where his mother should have been was empty. He ran back along the path they had taken, calling for her, but the only sound he heard was his own voice echoing through the forest. Panic overtook Ryan. How could she have disappeared so quickly? They had been together just seconds ago. He began to search frantically, pushing aside branches and shouting for his mother, but all he found was more silence. Ryan felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The terror of losing his mother and his father, the only family he had left, was overwhelming. He kept searching, tears beginning to blur his vision. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees growing taller and more menacing, as if they were conspiring to keep him there, alone. Then, in the middle of the forest, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Between the trees, there was a figure. It wasn't the silhouette of the forest ranger, but something more familiar, more personal. It was his mother. She was standing, her back to him, motionless. "Mom!" Ryan shouted, running toward her. But as he got closer, he stopped abruptly. Something was wrong, very wrong. His mother began to turn slowly, and Ryan felt a shiver run down his spine. When he finally saw her face, he knew immediately that this wasn't his mother. Her eyes were empty, lifeless, as if they were just black holes. And the smile on her face was unnatural, forced, as if someone had placed a grotesque mask on her face. Ryan backed away, feeling the panic rise. The figure that looked like his mother took a step toward him, extending her hand. "Ryan, my dear, come here," said the voice, but the tone was wrong, a grotesque imitation of his mother's voice. "You're not her," Ryan shouted, backing away further. "What did you do with her? Where is she?" The figure stopped, and the smile on her face widened unnaturally. "She's where everyone ends up," the voice said, now distorted and full of malice. "You can't escape, Ryan. The forest always takes what it wants." Ryan didn't wait to find out what the figure intended to do. He turned and ran with all his strength, tears streaming down his face. He needed to find his father, needed to get out of there before it was too late. As he ran, he felt the figure following him, its steps echoing sinisterly through the forest. But no matter how fast he ran, the feeling of being followed didn't diminish. He knew that the thing chasing him was relentless, that it wouldn't stop until it caught him. Ryan found himself in a desperate race against time and the terror that surrounded him. The forest, now denser and darker than ever, seemed to close in around him, each tree becoming a barrier, each shadow a threat. He knew he couldn't continue like this for much longer. Despair consumed him, but the hope of finding his father and saving his mother somehow still kept him moving. But with each step, the forest seemed more alive, more aware, as if it were playing a sadistic game with him. Ryan ran until he could no longer, until his legs burned and his breath became a mere gasp. But he knew deep down that he was running in circles, that there was no escape. And then, when he thought he couldn't go on any longer, the forest revealed a new clearing ahead, different from the others. In the center of the clearing was his father, tied to a tree, unconscious. Ryan felt a wave of relief mixed with horror. He ran to his father but stopped abruptly when he noticed something terrible. The figure that had followed him, the one that looked like his mother, was there too, now taking on a new form. It was the forest ranger, but with a distorted face, a grotesque fusion of the two figures that had tormented him. And he was smiling, waiting for Ryan, as if he knew he would arrive there. "Welcome, Ryan," the creature said, its voice a cacophony of all the voices he feared. "Now, the game really begins." Ryan knew he was on the brink of the abyss, where true terror awaited him, and he was alone. Ryan felt paralyzed as he saw the grotesque fusion of forms before him. The creature that had taken on the appearance of the forest ranger seemed to delight in the fear it inspired. The clearing was shrouded in an almost supernatural darkness, even with the dawn approaching. The only light left was the fear in Ryan's heart and the dread that he was about to lose everything. His father was tied to the tree, his head hanging to the side, as if unconscious but still alive. Ryan knew he couldn't waste time, but he also knew that any wrong move could seal the fate of them all. The creature took a step forward, its eyes gleaming with inhuman malice. "I thought you'd run longer, boy," it said, its voice echoing through the clearing as if the forest itself were speaking. "But I see you've finally understood. There's nowhere to run." Ryan felt his body tremble, but he fought to maintain control. He needed to think, needed to find a way to save his father and escape this impossible situation. But how do you fight something that isn't just a person, but a force of the forest itself? Something that could manipulate forms and voices, that knew his worst fears. He looked around, desperately searching for anything he could use as a weapon or an escape route. But the clearing seemed like a perfect trap, with no visible way out. "Why are you doing this?" Ryan managed to ask, trying to buy time. "What do you want from us?" The creature smiled, a smile that seemed to stretch its skin unnaturally. "The forest is hungry," it said, "and it hasn't fed as it should in a long time. I'm just a servant, a guardian who protects its secrets. And you, your father, your mother, you're just part of the cycle." "That doesn't make sense," Ryan shouted, trying to hide his despair. "We're not part of this. We're people, not sacrifices." The creature laughed, a horrible guttural sound that echoed through the trees. "Ah, but the forest doesn't distinguish. It feeds on fear, on life, on despair, and you, boy, have brought a tasty meal." Ryan felt a wave of anger mixed with terror. He knew he didn't have much time, but he had to act. He remembered the mask they had found, the mention in Emily's diary about the creature's eyes, and a crazy plan began to form in his mind. With a quick movement, Ryan reached for the mask in his backpack. He held it in front of him, like an improvised shield, and saw the creature stop abruptly, its eyes narrowing. "You think that will stop me?" the creature taunted, but Ryan saw a slight hesitation in it. "If you're the guardian of the forest, this must mean something to you," Ryan said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Maybe, if I destroy this, you'll lose your power." The creature roared, a sound of pure rage that made the trees around them tremble. "You have no idea what you're playing with, boy." Ryan realized he had touched on something important. Without hesitation, he threatened to tear the mask in half, his hands trembling with the force of desperation. "Let me take my father away. Leave my mother alone, or he'll destroy this." The creature took a step forward, its eyes fixed on the mask, but the hesitation was clear. "You don't know what you're doing," it growled. "The mask is the only thing keeping me from destroying everything here and now." Ryan felt a glimmer of hope. "Then let us go. Leave us alone and no one else needs to get hurt." The creature seemed to be waging an internal battle, but the look in its eyes revealed that it was losing the upper hand. It retreated slightly, but Ryan knew he couldn't trust it completely. He needed to get out of there, now. With the mask still in hand, he moved toward his father, keeping his eyes on the creature the entire time. Every step was torture, expecting it to lunge at him at any moment. When he finally reached his father, he began to untie the ropes that bound him to the tree. Ryan's father began to wake, his eyes slowly opening, confused and exhausted. "Ryan, what's happening?" he murmured. "We don't have time to explain," Ryan whispered, struggling with the thick ropes. "We need to get out of here now." Finally, the ropes gave way, and Ryan's father fell forward, supported by him. The creature watched, but didn't move, as if something were holding it back. Maybe it was the mask, maybe it was something else, but Ryan wasn't going to wait to find out. With his father leaning on his shoulder, Ryan began to back away slowly toward the edge of the clearing, keeping the mask raised as a constant threat. The creature followed them with its eyes, but didn't advance. "This isn't over," the creature growled. "You may escape today, but the forest always takes its due." Ryan didn't respond. He knew there was no victory here, only temporary survival. With heavy breaths and a pounding heart, he and his father finally reached the tree line. They didn't need any more encouragement. They started running, the father supported by Ryan, both exhausted but driven by pure survival instinct. The forest around them seemed alive, as if trying to prevent their escape, but they kept moving, driven by adrenaline. With each step, the dawn grew clearer, and Ryan knew they were approaching the edge of the forest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the dense forest onto a dirt road. The sun was beginning to rise, bathing the world in soft, soothing light. Ryan and his father collapsed to their knees on the road, breathless but relieved to finally be out of the creature's immediate reach. Are we safe?" Ryan's father asked, still panting. Ryan looked at the dark forest behind them, where the trees seemed to be silently watching. He knew that although they had escaped for now, the threat wasn't entirely resolved. "For now," Ryan replied, holding the mask tightly. "But we need to keep moving. The forest won't let us go that easily." They stood up, Ryan helping his father, and began walking along the road, hoping to find help. But as they moved away from the forest, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The forest had left a mark on his soul, and he knew he would need to be prepared for whatever came next. The game of survival wasn't over yet. The dirt road stretched endlessly ahead of Ryan and his father, each step heavy with accumulated exhaustion and the shadow of the terror they had left behind. The sun slowly rose, bringing light that felt less welcoming than it should have. The forest, still visible in the distance, seemed to be watching them, a constant and menacing presence that wouldn't let Ryan relax. As they walked, Ryan's father, still weak, leaned heavily on his son. "You saved my life, Ryan," he said, his voice rough and filled with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Ryan forced a smile, but the truth was he was far from feeling relieved. The mask was still in his backpack, and the sense that something was about to happen hadn't left him. They had escaped, yes, but at what cost? The creature, the forest itself, seemed to have left a mark on Ryan, a connection he didn't know how to break. "We need to find help," Ryan responded, trying to hide the fear in his voice. "We're not safe until we're far away from here." They continued walking, their footsteps echoing on the empty road. The feeling of despair grew, and Ryan knew they couldn't go on like this much longer. They needed a plan, a safe place, but everything seemed to be against them. Then they heard the sound of an engine in the distance. Ryan stopped, listening carefully, his heart beating faster. A car, maybe. Could it be the help they needed? He and his father looked in the direction of the sound, and soon a small truck appeared around the bend in the road, heading their way. Ryan waved desperately to catch the driver's attention. The truck slowed down, stopping a few meters in front of them. The driver, a middle-aged man with a worn baseball cap, looked at them with a curious expression. "Are you guys okay?" he asked, getting out of the truck and approaching. "What are you doing out here in the middle of nowhere?" "We need help," Ryan said quickly. "We were camping in the forest, but something happened. My father is hurt. We need a hospital." The man looked at them with evident concern. "Get in the truck. I'll take you to the nearest hospital," he said, helping Ryan's father into the cab. Ryan felt a wave of relief at finally being in a vehicle that would take them away from that place. But part of his mind was still on alert, waiting for the next blow. As the truck began to move, Ryan looked out the back window, watching the forest recede. The road became increasingly winding, climbing hills and descending valleys, until the forest disappeared completely from view. He tried to relax, but the weight of the mask in his backpack was a constant reminder that they were still not out of danger. "So, what happened back there?" the driver asked, trying to make conversation as he drove. "You two look like you've seen a ghost." Ryan exchanged a quick glance with his father, unsure of how much to reveal. The story was so unbelievable that he feared the man would think they were crazy. There was "Something in the forest," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Something we couldn't explain. It was like the forest was alive." The driver frowned but said nothing for a moment. Then he sighed. "That forest has its stories, you know. Many say it's cursed, that bad things happen to those who dare go too deep. I never believed much in it, but seeing you, maybe there's something to it." Ryan felt a chill. "Have you ever heard of anyone disappearing there?" he asked. The driver nodded slowly. "Yeah, a few people. Always camping or going fishing, but most are never found. They just say the forest took them." Silence fell over them again, heavy and uncomfortable. Ryan began to realize that although they were leaving the forest behind, the horrors they faced there might never leave them. The mark the forest left on his mind and soul was deep, and he didn't know if he would ever be able to forget. They drove for hours, time passing slowly, until they finally arrived in a small town. The hospital was modest but welcoming, and the doctors quickly began treating Ryan's father. He was dehydrated, exhausted, but fortunately without serious injuries. While his father was treated, Ryan sat in the waiting room, the mask still in his backpack, like a dark secret he couldn't share. It was there, in that silent waiting room, that Ryan began to think about the future. They had escaped, but he knew the creature, the forest, was still out there, waiting. And the mask. The mask was the key to everything. He could feel it. But what to do with it? Destroy it? Keep it hidden? He didn't know. When they finally left the hospital, Ryan's father was much better, though still shaken. They took a taxi to a nearby hotel where they could rest before deciding what to do next. In the hotel room, Ryan placed the mask on the table, staring at it. "We need to get rid of this," Ryan's father said, his gaze fixed on the mask. "It's like poison, and as long as it's with us, we're not safe." Ryan agreed, but knew it wasn't that simple. Destroying the mask could have unpredictable consequences, perhaps even releasing something worse. But keeping it also seemed like a bad idea. They were in a dilemma, unsure of which path to take. Maybe we need to find someone who understands this," Ryan suggested, his voice hesitant. "Someone who knows how to deal with this sort of thing." Ryan's father nodded, but the exhaustion in his eyes showed that he didn't want to think about it anymore at that moment. "Tomorrow," he said, sighing. "We'll rest now, and tomorrow we'll see what to do." Ryan agreed, but knew that the night wouldn't bring rest. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while images of the forest, the creature, and the mask swirled in his mind. The survival game wasn't over, and Ryan had the feeling that the worst was yet to come. He closed his eyes, but sleep was far from reaching him. Outside, beyond the hotel windows, the wind howled like a reminder that the forest was always near, even when it seemed miles away. And Ryan knew deep down that one day he would have to go back. The night at the hotel was as restless as Ryan had feared. He tossed and turned in bed, sleep refusing to come while dark thoughts occupied his mind. The mask resting on the table seemed to watch everything, a silent reminder that the danger was still close. His father slept in the bed next to him, but his sleep was equally disturbed, marked by restless movements and involuntary murmurs. Ryan finally gave up trying to sleep and got up, going to the window. The sleeping city was quiet, with only a few lights flickering in the distance. Everything seemed so far from the forest, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had followed them here. He turned his gaze to the mask, feeling a mix of revulsion and fascination. There was something about it that attracted him, as if it held answers to questions he didn't yet know how to ask, but at the same time, he felt that getting too close would risk losing something fundamental in himself. Suddenly, a sound interrupted his thoughts. It was a low noise, like a whisper, coming from the direction of the mask. Ryan froze, his heart beating fast. He knew he shouldn't approach, but something stronger than himself pushed him forward. With hesitant steps, he went to the table and leaned over the object. The whisper continued, and this time he could understand the words. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but clearly coming from the mask. "Come back, to the forest," the voice said, repeating itself in a hypnotic mantra. Ryan tried to resist, but the words began to penetrate his mind, as if they were directly connected to his deepest thoughts. Before he could react, the room door was abruptly opened, and his father entered, his face pale and his eyes wide. "Ryan, what are you doing?" he shouted, running to him and pulling him away from the mask. Ryan blinked, as if waking from a trance. I don't know," he stammered, looking at his father with fear in his eyes. "The mask. It's whispering to me." Ryan's father looked at the object on the table with a grim expression. "I knew we shouldn't have brought it with us," he said, his voice filled with dread. "We need to get rid of it, now." Ryan agreed, but before they could decide what to do, the sound of the wind outside began to rise, turning into a supernatural howl that seemed to surround the hotel. The windows rattled and the lights flickered as if a storm was about to descend on them. "Something is coming," Ryan whispered, his body tense. He knew this wasn't an ordinary storm. It was the forest, or whatever was connected to it, trying to reach them again. Without wasting any more time, they grabbed the mask and left the room, quickly descending the stairs. The hotel felt strange, as if time had been distorted, every sound amplified, and every shadow darker than it should have been. They crossed the empty lobby, where the receptionist slept soundly, oblivious to what was happening. When they reached the street, the wind hit them with force, but there was no rain, just that haunting sound, which seemed to come from all directions. Ryan looked around, trying to decide what to do, but the sense of urgency only increased. "We have to destroy it," Ryan's father said, looking around as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. "There's a river not far from here. If we throw the mask into the current, maybe it will be carried away." With no better alternatives, Ryan agreed, and they began running through the deserted streets toward the river. The wind followed them, like a living entity, and the feeling of being hunted never left them. At every corner they turned, they expected to see the figure of the forest ranger emerge, but what was pursuing them was even more insidious. It was the spirit of the forest itself, extending its darkness beyond its limits. When they finally reached the river, the water flowed fast and deep, reflecting the town's faint lights. The sound of the wind was muffled by the roar of the current, but the sense of imminent danger was stronger than ever. Ryan took the mask out of his backpack and looked at it one last time. There was something final about it all, as if he knew he was about to make a decision that would change everything. But he also knew he couldn't hesitate. He raised the mask, ready to throw it into the water, when the wind howled even louder, and an invisible force seemed to pull him back. "No," Ryan shouted, fighting against the force trying to stop the act. Ryan's father ran to help him, holding him tightly. "Do it, Ryan, now," he urged, his voice filled with desperation. With one final effort, Ryan threw the mask into the river, and they watched as it disappeared beneath the murky waters. For a moment, everything went silent. The wind stopped, and the night seemed to return to normal. But Ryan knew this didn't mean everything was over. They stood there by the river, panting and waiting for what would come next. But surprisingly, nothing happened. The river continued its course, and the town around them remained quiet. Ryan began to believe that maybe, finally, they had succeeded. But then, a low and familiar sound began to echo in the distance. It was the same whisper he had heard before, coming from the mask. Only this time, it came from deep within the forest, where they had left the horror behind. "It cannot be destroyed," said the dark voice in the wind. "The forest always finds a way." Ryan looked at his father, the fear returning in full force. They had thrown the mask into the river, but the connection to the forest was still there, stronger than ever. And now the darkness seemed to be closing in again, ready to claim them. "We need to leave, and quickly," said Ryan's father, pulling him by the hand. "We can't stay here." They started moving away from the river, running back toward the town. But Ryan knew that the threat hadn't been eliminated. The forest was alive, and they were still within its reach. And deep in his mind, he knew that eventually the mask would return, bringing with it an even greater terror. The game was far from over, and Ryan feared that when the forest came to claim its price again, there would be no escape. Ryan and his father ran through the deserted streets of the small town, but no matter how far they got from the river and the forest, the sense of imminent danger followed them like a shadow. The whisper of the mask still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that the threat hadn't been eliminated. They finally reached the hotel, exhausted and breathless, but the relief of being back in the room was tenuous. Ryan's father locked the door behind them, but both knew it meant little in the face of what they were up against. Ryan sat on the bed, his head down, thoughts in turmoil. "We threw the mask into the river, but I still feel like it's here, watching us," he said, his voice weak. His father nodded, running a hand through his hair, clearly shaken. "I feel it too, like something is following us, even now." He approached Ryan and placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "But we need to rest, son. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." Ryan knew his father was right, but sleep seemed impossible. He lay in bed, but his thoughts continued to revolve around the forest, the mask, and the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. After a few hours of restless sleep, Ryan was awakened by a sound, a faint rustling, like something was moving inside the room. He opened his eyes and for a moment saw nothing out of the ordinary. But then something caught his attention. The backpack he had left beside the bed was slightly open. With his heart racing, Ryan slowly got up and went to the backpack. When he opened it completely, he felt the blood drain from his face. Inside the backpack, wrapped in a damp cloth, was the mask, the same mask he had thrown into the river. Ryan backed away, feeling an uncontrollable dread. "Dad!" he shouted, his voice trembling. "The mask, it's back!" His father immediately woke up and ran to his side. Seeing the mask, the expression of horror on his face was instant. This isn't possible. We threw it into the river." But there it was, as real as before, the cloth that wrapped it still wet, as if it had just emerged from the waters. Ryan felt the same dark energy emanating from it, a presence that seemed to envelop the room in an oppressive atmosphere. Ryan's father began to say something, but was interrupted by the sound of knocking on the room door. Slow but firm, the knocks echoed in the silence of the early morning. Ryan and his father exchanged a look filled with fear. Neither dared move. The knocks continued, becoming more insistent until they finally stopped, replaced by an absolute silence. Ryan looked at the door, waiting for something horrible to happen, but nothing moved. The silence lingered for a few minutes, until a low sound began to emerge from the other side of the door. A whisper, similar to the one he had heard before, but this time clearer, more menacing. "Open the door, Ryan," said the voice. It was the same tone as the forest ranger, but distorted, as if coming from somewhere deep and inhuman. "You know you can't escape." Ryan took a step back, his eyes wide with terror. "What are we going to do?" he whispered to his father, who also seemed to be in shock. His father took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "We can't open that door. Whatever it is, we can't let it in." But then, the whisper changed, turning into a voice that Ryan instantly recognized, his mother's voice. "Ryan, it's me. Please, open the door. I'm scared." Ryan's heart clenched at the sound of that voice. He knew it was impossible, but the sound of his mother's voice was so real, so full of despair, that he almost believed it. Almost. "This isn't real," his father said firmly, though his own voice trembled. "It's not your mother. It's the forest, trying to trick us." Ryan nodded, trying to push away the terror that threatened to overwhelm him. But the voice continued, growing more insistent, more convincing. "Ryan, please, I need you. Open the door." Finally, the sound abruptly ceased, leaving only silence. Ryan and his father stood there, motionless, the air heavy with tension. Then, the door began to slowly open, as if being pushed by an invisible force. Ryan backed away further, pulling his father with him. "We can't let this happen," he murmured, his entire body trembling. But before they could react, the door opened fully, and the figure that entered made Ryan's blood run cold. It was his mother, or at least something that looked like her. The figure was shrouded in dark mist, and her eyes were empty, lifeless, like those he had seen before in the forest. She walked slowly into the room, her arms outstretched toward Ryan. "Please, Ryan," the figure pleaded, but there was something wrong in the voice, something that made it cold and inhuman. "You need to come with me." Ryan was paralyzed with fear, not knowing what to do. He knew that wasn't his mother, but the pain of seeing her, even in such a distorted form, was unbearable. Then, Ryan's father stepped between them, his face resolute but full of sadness. "You're not taking him," he said, his voice firm but low. "You've taken everything from me, but you're not taking my son." The figure that resembled Ryan's mother stopped, as if considering his words. "You don't understand," she said, her voice almost soft. "The forest wants all of us. We can't escape. We can't resist." "Maybe we can't escape," Ryan's father replied, his hands clenched into fists. "But I can fight." And with that, he lunged at the figure, pushing her out of the room with a strength Ryan didn't know his father still had. There was a sound of struggle outside, and Ryan ran to the door to see what was happening. But when he reached the hallway, there was no one there. The figure, his father, all had disappeared. Silence reigned again, but it was a heavy, oppressive silence. Ryan felt despair engulf him. He was alone, completely alone, and the terror of the forest seemed closer than ever. The whisper returned, this time coming from all sides, and Ryan realized that the mask, the forest, and the creature were all connected in a way he still didn't fully understand. But one thing he knew for sure, the game wasn't over, and he would need all his courage to face what would come next. Ryan stood paralyzed in the empty hallway of the hotel, the silence around him heavy and suffocating. His father had disappeared, taken by the force controlling the distorted figure of his mother, and now he was alone, facing a terror that seemed invincible. The whisper continued, growing more insistent, as if trying to invade his mind, but Ryan knew he couldn't give in. Taking a deep breath, he returned to the room, his thoughts in turmoil. The mask was still on the table, a sinister symbol of everything that had happened. He knew he needed answers, that he needed to understand what he was up against if he wanted to save his father and himself. Determined, Ryan grabbed the mask, feeling the cold weight of the object in his hands. He knew there was something deeper, something the mask held that he hadn't yet discovered. Maybe if he could understand what the forest really wanted, he could find a way to reverse what had happened. With the mask in hand, Ryan left the hotel and began walking through the deserted streets of the town. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but something guided him, an intuition that led him back to the forest, where it all began. The cold wind blew against him, but Ryan kept going, determined to face whatever was waiting. The forest loomed ahead of him, the trees towering and threatening, like guardians of an ancient secret. Ryan hesitated for a moment at the entrance, remembering all the horrors he had faced there, but he knew he had no choice. He entered the forest, his steps quick and determined, guided by a determination he didn't know he had. The whisper returned to surround him, but this time Ryan didn't let it shake him. He knew the forest was trying to intimidate him, but he needed to stay focused. With each step, the feeling of being watched grew, but Ryan continued, holding the mask tightly. After what felt like an eternity, Ryan reached a clearing that felt different from the others. The air there was heavy, as if the very atmosphere was impregnated with something ancient and malevolent. In the center of the clearing, a large stone rose from the ground, with strange symbols carved into its surface. Ryan felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew he was close to discovering the truth. He approached the stone, his eyes fixed on the symbols, trying to decipher them. The mask seemed to pulse in his hands, as if reacting to the proximity of the stone. Ryan hesitated for a moment, but he knew he had to do this. With a determined motion, he put on the mask. Immediately, the world around him changed. The forest, once dark and oppressive, became even more distorted. The trees seemed to move, the shadows lengthened, and the whisper became a deafening roar. But along with the chaos, Ryan began to see images. Fragments of memories that weren't his, but the mask's. He saw the forest as it was long ago, a sacred land protected by guardians who wore the mask to connect with the power of nature. But over time, the power was corrupted, and the mask became a symbol of destruction, used by those who wanted to control the forest and its secrets. The creature he had faced was not an ordinary man, but the last of these corrupted guardians, transformed by the mask into something monstrous. And then he saw his mother. She was in the same clearing, surrounded by shadows that tried to consume her. The vision was a blow to Ryan's heart, but he knew it wasn't real, just an attempt by the forest to manipulate him. He needed to stay in control, needed to use the knowledge he had gained. With tremendous effort, Ryan removed the mask, panting and sweating. The vision stopped, but the clearing around him seemed even more threatening. He knew the mask couldn't be destroyed in the conventional way. It was an ancient artifact, tied to the very essence of the forest. To defeat the creature, he needed to break that connection. Then Ryan remembered Emily's diary, the words she had written about the Guardian's eyes. He understood what he needed to do. The mask was the link that connected the creature to the forest, but it was also its weakness. With renewed determination, Ryan lifted the mask and held it before the stone. He felt the mask's resistance, as if it were fighting against him. But Ryan didn't back down. He knew he had to break the cycle, destroy the corrupt power the mask represented. He closed his eyes and, with all the strength he had left, threw the mask against the stone. The impact was followed by a loud sound, almost deafening, as if the very air was being torn apart. The mask shattered, its pieces falling to the ground, and with it, the deafening roar of the forest began to diminish. The clearing fell silent. Ryan collapsed to his knees, exhausted, but feeling that something had changed. The forest around him felt less oppressive, as if a weight had been lifted. He knew the mask was destroyed, and with it, the power that controlled the creature had been broken. But he also knew the fight wasn't over. He needed to find his father, needed to finish what he had started. With difficulty, Ryan stood up, looking around the clearing. Then he heard a faint sound coming from somewhere nearby. He quickly turned and saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was his father, injured and exhausted, but alive. Ryan ran to him, tears of relief streaming down his face. "Dad!" Ryan shouted, hugging him tightly. I thought you were..." "I'm here, son," his father replied, his voice weak but filled with relief. "You did it. You destroyed the mask." Ryan nodded, feeling a wave of relief that almost made him collapse. But he knew they couldn't let their guard down yet. The forest was still alive, still full of secrets and dangers, but at least now, without the mask, the immediate threat had been neutralized. "We need to get out of here," Ryan said, helping his father to his feet, "before something else happens." With difficulty, the two began to walk out of the clearing, leaving behind the mask's remains and the horrors it had caused. The forest, though still imposing, seemed less hostile, as if it was slowly returning to what it should have been. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn began to tint the sky. Ryan looked back one last time, knowing he would never forget what had happened there. But he also knew he had won, that he had survived, and that at least for now, the forest had been silenced. But even as they walked out of the forest, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere the darkness still lurked, waiting for the right moment to manifest again. The mask was destroyed, but what it represented, the power that had corrupted the forest, was still there, hidden in the depths. And Ryan knew that if necessary, he would be ready to face that darkness again. Ryan and his father walked out of the forest, but the relief they had expected to feel upon reaching the safety of dawn was replaced by a growing unease. Although the mask was destroyed and the immediate power of the corrupted guardian had been neutralized, something inside Ryan told him the danger was far from completely gone. The dirt road that led to the forest was now in front of them, but instead of seeming like a path to freedom, it stretched endlessly, each step harder than the last. The air was heavy, as if nature itself was still watching them, waiting for something. "We need to keep going," Ryan said to his father, forcing himself to move forward. "We can't stop now." His father, exhausted and still injured from the previous fight, agreed with a nod. Though he was clearly at the limit of his strength, he knew they couldn't afford to rest until they were far, far from the forest. As they walked, the sun began to rise on the horizon, but the light, instead of dispelling the darkness around them, seemed to increase the contrast between hope and fear. Time seemed to be against them, as if something was approaching, something that could destroy the fragile sense of security they had gained. Then Ryan heard a distant sound, a low hum that quickly became a roar. Looking back, he saw something that made his heart stop for a moment. A black mist, dense and pulsating, began to rise from the forest, spreading along the road toward them. "Run!" Ryan shouted to his father without hesitation. He didn't know what the mist was, but he knew it wasn't something good. They began to run, their legs burning with exhaustion, but fear propelled them forward. The mist followed them, fast and relentless, swallowing everything in its path. Every second was a battle against fatigue and terror. Ryan felt sweat dripping down his face, his heart pounding in his chest. The roar of the mist grew closer, and he knew they didn't have much time. "Don't look back," he shouted to his father. "Just keep running." The road began to slope upward, making the run even more difficult. Ryan felt his strength begin to fail, but he knew he couldn't stop. If the mist caught them, everything they had done would be in vain. Then ahead, Ryan saw something that renewed his hope. An old wooden bridge crossed a wide and rushing river. He knew that if they could cross it, they might have a chance to escape the mist. "Dad, the bridge!" Ryan shouted, pointing. "We need to cross." They ran toward the bridge, the roar of the mist growing louder, almost deafening. Ryan could feel the air getting heavier, the presence of the mist almost palpable. Finally, they reached the bridge and began to cross it. The wood creaked under their feet, but they didn't stop. The river below was fast and deep, and Ryan knew that falling would be fatal. The mist drew closer, now almost touching their heels. Every step was a race against time, against fear. When they finally reached the other side of the bridge, Ryan and his father collapsed to the ground, panting and exhausted. The mist stopped at the edge of the bridge, as if being held back by an invisible barrier. Ryan looked back, watching the dark, pulsating mass that seemed alive, writhing at the river's edge, but unable to cross it. They had made it. They were safe, at least for now. Ryan got up with difficulty and helped his father do the same. "We need to keep going," he said, his voice weak but determined. "We don't know how long that barrier will hold the mist." With Ryan's help, his father managed to stand, and the two began to move away from the bridge, still with their hearts racing. The sun now shone brighter, lighting the path ahead, but the sense of impending danger didn't leave them. As they walked, Ryan couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The mist, the mask, the forest, everything seemed connected in a way he still didn't fully understand. But one thing he knew, the fight was far from over. Whatever was in the mist still wanted them, and he needed to figure out how to stop it from reaching them again. They walked for a few more hours until they finally saw a small village in the distance. The houses were simple, and there were few people on the streets, but for Ryan and his father, it was a sign of hope, a place where they could rest and maybe find help. When they reached the village, they were greeted by an elderly man who looked at them with curiosity and concern. "You look tired," he said with a gentle smile. Come in, we have food and water." Ryan and his father accepted the offer, grateful to finally be able to rest. The man led them to his home, a simple but cozy cabin. Inside, they sat at the table, while the man offered them a hot meal and something to drink. "You came from the forest, didn't you?" the man asked as he set the food on the table. "It's rare for someone to come out of there, let alone alive." Ryan nodded, but didn't know how to respond. The man seemed to know more than he was letting on, and Ryan was too tired to unravel new mysteries at that moment. "Rest for now," the man said, noticing the exhaustion on their faces. "Tomorrow we can talk more." Ryan thanked him, feeling the weight of exhaustion finally overtake him. He and his father settled into a small room at the back of the cabin, where there were two simple but comfortable beds. Ryan lay down, and for the first time in a long time, felt like he could actually sleep. But as sleep enveloped him, one last image came to his mind. The mist stopped at the bridge, pulsating with a dark energy. Ryan knew that although they had escaped for now, the darkness still pursued them, and that the fight was far from over. He knew that when the sun rose, he would have to be ready for the next step, because one way or another, the forest still wanted something from him, and he would need to find out what, before it was too late. Ryan awoke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the cabin windows. The smell of burning wood and fresh coffee filled the air, bringing a brief moment of comfort. But as soon as his eyes fully opened, reality hit with full force. They were still being hunted. The mist, the forest, and the mystery surrounding them were threats that couldn't be ignored. He got up, feeling every muscle ache from the desperate run the day before. His father still slept, exhausted, but Ryan knew they couldn't waste time. The darkness that pursued them wouldn't give them a reprieve for long. Leaving the room, Ryan found the elderly man who had taken them in. He was sitting at the table, sipping a cup of coffee and looking outside as if he was expecting something. "Good morning," the man said with a nod. "Did you sleep well?" Ryan nodded, but couldn't hide the anxiety in his voice. "We need to get out of here," he said, without preamble. "The thing that's after us, it won't stop." The man sighed, as if he had expected this answer. He set the cup aside and looked directly at Ryan, his eyes full of a wisdom that came from years of experience. "I know what's after you," he said calmly. "The mist, the forest, they're ancient forces, forces that were awakened a long time ago. And now, they want something from you." Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. "But what? What do they want from me?" The man paused as if choosing his words carefully. "You carry the last vestige of the power that corrupted this land," he said. "Even with the mask destroyed, its essence is still connected to you. The mist wants that essence back, to complete itself." Ryan tried to process what the man was saying. "So, I'm the target? And if the mist catches me, what happens?" The man looked down, his expression grim. "If it gets what it wants, the forest will become a place of complete darkness, and the power the mask held will be unleashed. The corruption will spread, consuming everything in its path." Ryan felt despair rise within him. "How do I stop it? How do I break this connection?" The man stood and went to a shelf, picking up an old leather-bound book. He opened it carefully, the pages yellowed and filled with symbols and ancient writings. "There is a ritual," he said, showing the book to Ryan. "An ancient ritual that can purify what's left of the mask and break the connection once and for all." Ryan looked at the book, feeling a mix of hope and fear. "What do I have to do?" The man pointed to a specific passage in the book. "The ritual needs to be performed in the heart of the forest, in the same place where the power was corrupted. You'll need to use what's left of the mask, the fragments you destroyed. Only there, where it all began, can you end this." Ryan felt the weight of the man's words. The idea of going back to the forest, to the place where it all began, was terrifying, but he knew he had no choice. If he didn't do it, the darkness would continue to pursue them, and what was left of the world around them would be consumed. "I'll do it," Ryan said, with determination. "But what about my father? He needs to be safe." The man nodded. "I'll take care of him while you go, but you need to be quick. The mist already knows you're here, and it won't take long to reach you." Ryan felt a wave of gratitude for the man, but he also knew he couldn't waste any more time. He returned to the room and woke his father, quickly explaining what needed to be done. Though reluctant to let his son go alone, Ryan's father knew there was no other option. "I'll be back," Ryan promised, hugging his father tightly. "I need to finish this." With the book in hand and the elderly man's instructions in his mind, Ryan left the cabin and began his walk back to the forest. The road that once seemed endless now seemed like a direct path to the final confrontation. The sun was high, but the presence of the mist in the distance, hovering at the forest's edge, was a constant reminder of the danger. When he reached the entrance of the forest, Ryan took a deep breath, feeling the tension in every fiber of his being. He knew what he was about to do was risky, but he also knew it was the only way to save himself, his father, and everyone the forest threatened. Entering the forest, Ryan followed the path that led him to the central clearing, where the power of the mask had been corrupted. The path was strange, as if the forest was alive and aware of his presence. The trees seemed to close around him, but Ryan didn't let fear take over. He knew he couldn't deviate from his goal. Finally, he reached the clearing. The air there was dense, heavy, as if time itself had stopped. The ground was covered with the fragments of the mask he had destroyed earlier, and Ryan knew this was where it all had to end. He opened the book and began to read the ritual's words, his heart beating fast. The ancient words left his mouth, filled with power, and he felt the atmosphere around him change. The mist began to stir, as if it sensed what was happening, but Ryan kept going. As he recited the ritual, the mask fragments began to move, as if being pulled by an invisible force. The mist, now visible at the clearing's edge, pulsed with a dark energy, trying to reach him. Ryan knew he had to be quick. With one last effort, he raised his hands and, with the final words of the ritual, threw the fragments into the clearing's center. A flash of light exploded, blinding him momentarily. When the light faded, Ryan collapsed to his knees, exhausted. The clearing was silent, and the mist had disappeared. The air was clear, and the oppressive feeling that had permeated the place was gone. He had done it. The mask's power had been purified, and the connection to the forest's darkness was broken. With difficulty, Ryan stood up and began walking out of the forest. Each step was a struggle against exhaustion, but he knew he needed to leave before anything else happened. When he finally emerged from the forest, the sun was shining brightly. The road back to the village was clear and open, and Ryan felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He returned to the elderly man's cabin, where his father was waiting, anxious. Upon seeing Ryan, his father ran to hug him, tears of relief in his eyes. "You did it," his father said, his voice choked with emotion. "You really did it." Ryan nodded, feeling a wave of relief and fatigue. "It's done," he said, with a weak smile. "The forest is at peace." The elderly man, who had been watching closely, smiled and nodded. "You did what few have managed, Ryan. You freed the forest from its curse. Now, it can return to what it was before, a place of life, not darkness. Ryan knew the man was right, but he also knew that what he had faced would leave marks on his mind and soul. But for now, he was at peace, knowing he had saved those he loved and protected the world from a darkness that almost consumed it. They spent the rest of the day in the cabin, resting and regaining their strength. When night fell, Ryan looked up at the starry sky and for the first time in a long time felt that he could finally rest. He knew the future was still uncertain, but he also knew that if the darkness returned, he would be ready, because now he understood the true power of the forest and was prepared to face it if necessary.